Good evening, welcome. My name's Jason Newton, and I'm really happy to be here at West Green Valley because I probably walked across the last Green Valley a couple of times on this project. And I'll have a chance over the next 45 minutes or so to share some of the things that I found along the way. I want to warn you that I have a homework assignment for you that involves some effort out in the future. We'll give you a chance to consider that. You know, we will maybe have you come back afterwards and see how you did on the exam and how you're able to report on it. But I started out about 4 years ago. I had a privilege and opportunity to retire. As a family history project, I took upon myself the challenge of trying to follow my ancestors on down to Connecticut. My ancestors include Thomas Hooker, and who came to Connecticut with his congregation in 1636. And fortunately for me, doing this project, my uncle had done all the heavy lifting and doing all the genealogical stuff on the family history. So I was left with what I thought would be the easy task of finding their route and seeing if I could learn something and share it about this trail that they followed, which would have been probably the first westward migration in America, going back in 1636, and it happened right here, coming on down through Connecticut. So I'm happy to be here in the last Green Valley, and I'll share some of the things that have been going on with this project of mine. It's a project, and it's an obsession. Sometimes it's like work, and then it's a lot of fun too. And as I said, I didn't grow up in Connecticut, so I don't have any of the school Thomas Hooker stuff. I know you probably all know everything about Thomas Hooker, but I came in not really knowing too much about him, even though I'm discovering him. He's my ancestor. And I'm a direct descendant because his daughter, Mary Hooker, married Roger Newton, who went down to live in the Hooker family home in Hartford to prepare for the ministry. So from Roger Newton and Mary Hooker on down, it's 350 years, and fortunately for me, I haven't had to carry the Hooker name for all those years, but there are others who have, and they've survived. So I figured I need to learn more about Thomas Hooker and this whole era, and I don't know about you, but going back into colonial history, it's kind of like the black hole in my knowledge. I knew about Plymouth Rock. We all know that the Mayflower managed to pull right up to the rock, and everybody stepped out on it, and then they had Thanksgiving, and that's that story. And then the next thing we all know about is Lexington and Concord, that they went marching out there, and the British got driven back to Boston. But in between, it's really, we never really learned very much about it in school. And then any time we thought about learning about it, we said, well, gee, there's always something else that might be more interesting. So I went out looking for this route of Thomas Hooker, and I figured, well, Woodstock's a good place over here to check out, and so I went on over to Woodstock and went to the library there, and I asked the librarian to help me out in finding information. And I said, I'm here looking for, follow the route of Thomas Hooker who came through here, and she went, he did? I said, yes, there's a sign out front that said he went through here. Oh, but she was very helpful, but I'm going, okay, well, she lives here and she doesn't know, so I guess this could be a little more interesting. I did find that there is a tradition of celebrating Thomas Hooker here in Connecticut that lives on at the Hooker Days in Hartford, where they have a parade, and they have a certain spiritual carrying on that goes on. They enjoy their time with the Hooker Brew. Still didn't seem to get too much on Thomas Hooker, and the treatment of Hooker, I figured, well, maybe it's a little better up in Massachusetts, and they have a Hooker statue of one of the descendants of Thomas Hooker, and all the politicians in Massachusetts and the legislature go to Hooker Gate. They travel into the State House through the Hooker Gate. So I really wasn't getting too much on the history out there, so I had to do a little digging, and I found that this person who is celebrated in some ways that I'm sure he never would have imagined in his time, was really a leader and scholar, as a minister and reformer in England. And he got tied in with, the founding of Hartford, the New England Confederation, where the colonies were learning to begin working together. And one of the statesmen who was called upon in his time here in America to help mediate conflicts that were occurring in the colonies. And this thing that really gets kind of lofty is the father of American democracy. So going back to England, where he came from, that he grew up and matured in an environment that there was great conflict and upheaval in England at the time. And as a minister, he was one of the most outspoken Puritans in England, drew larger crowds coming to him, and attracted the young ministers to come to him because of the power of his ability to explain Scripture and set a direction on what a just and godly society would look like, and he hoped would happen in England. Unfortunately, with the powers of the King Charles, and Archbishop Laud, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, sort of like the Pope of England, they were heavily into suppressing the Puritans. And Hooker was number one on their list for suppression. So Hooker had to leave England to go to Holland because he likely would have wound up in prison for heresy. And did arrange to escape to come to America. But before he left, he spoke to the people of England, and in his final sermon, there will be a war in England. And he was correct. The forces were in play in England that led to the outbreak of the English Civil War. And it was a bloody war. I think if we adjusted it to our population, the number that died during that period, it would be somewhere around 14 million. It was a huge number. That's adjusting it so that if it happened in America at this time, it would be like we'd be on the news saying 14 million people died. It was obviously a much smaller number there, but it was a huge, devastating process that was driven by economic issues, religious issues, and political issues, and conflict with the king. King Charles, who was suppressing the Puritans, was overthrown and beheaded. And Archbishop Laud, who was suppressing Thomas Hooker, was executed. So in this conflict that followed Hooker's leaving, the conflict in England set a lot of the roots for changes in England, and also certainly set the precedents for overthrowing the king that the Puritans carried with them here to America, and probably set the roots for the American Revolution. Now, we're all fortunate that we have nearby, we can go down to Plymouth and walk on the Mayflower, which is very much like the ships that carried the Puritans over in the Great Migration from England. 150 to 200 people crammed below deck who'd never been to sea, for 2 to 3 months on a voyage across the ocean. And they paid for their passage, and they traveled as families. And they were not traveling as a whole community or town, they were forming their own community on board ship. So Hooker and his family traveled across on a 2-month journey. They left in June and arrived in September, beginning of September 1633.
How old was Thomas Hooker when he?
Gosh, you asked me that. I think he would have been about in his 40s.
So he was born in the 1500s?
Yeah, late 1500s, yeah. So he was established as a minister and an elder minister by the 1630 period. So he was well known for his writing, for his preaching, and had a tremendous impact on young ministers coming up, many of whom came to America.
So when he ended up settling over in Hartford, he would have been in his late 40s?
Yeah. So when they arrived, and I didn't realize this, they arrived at Cambridge, which was then called Newtown. And he arrived to a group called the Hooker Company. They had already considered themselves the group or congregation of Thomas Hooker, and they, together with Thomas Hooker, planned their journey from Cambridge or Newtown to a place out in the wilderness. And they weren't quite sure where they were going to go. They looked at the Merrimack Valley and they looked at some other locations, and they settled on heading to Connecticut. And so in 1636, we have a record from Governor Winthrop that Thomas Hooker and most of his congregation went on down to Connecticut, driving 160 cattle. And we have to understand that when they left Newtown, or Cambridge, if we go out to the green, the common right outside, opposite Harvard University would be about the area that they left from. Once they got just beyond Route 128, they were into, quote, the wilderness. So times have changed, you know. And they were traveling about 10 miles a day, I figured. When you're driving cattle, they don't move too quickly, and walking is hard. But there were others that went down to Connecticut at that time. There was John Oldham, who went down, was the first white or Englishman to travel to Connecticut along the Indian Path in 1633, 1634, with the adventurers that went down to set up in Wethersfield. John Wareham led a congregation from Dorchester outside of Boston on down to Windsor, and in addition to Thomas Hooker and his congregation. And there were other groups that went down, smaller groups that went sort of as the advanced teams to help plan and set up for the larger groups coming down. This monument is actually up in Ashford on Route 89, and you can go up there and see this. It's right here. You'll get some direction on it. Now this story I found really it resonates with the history of Connecticut. And this diorama is actually up on the Connecticut State House. It shows the Hooker's march to Hartford as one of the pivotal events in the establishment of Connecticut. And as we go downtown in Hartford, there's Thomas Hooker standing in front of the State House at a location that played an important part in Connecticut history, which we'll get to in just a moment. And the statue of the safe arrival that depicts Thomas Hooker with part of his family. His family, he and his wife traveled with 5 children across the wilderness. She was carried on a horse litter. She wasn't disabled as far as we know, I think because she had a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 6-year-old. She was given a little bit of help by her husband to get here. But my ancestor, Mary, the second oldest daughter, the story was that she walked alongside her mother, helping to take care of the children. So the journey was about a little over 100 miles. for walking. So it wasn't an overnight, one-time trip. It was 10 days at least walking. And when they arrived in Connecticut, because I walked across and traveled across so much of it, I reached a point when I got out of the woods and I'm really looking at Connecticut from a little bit above. It's a gorgeous place, and they must have been experiencing this as they were traveling days through the wilderness. That, you know, that kind of, my God, what have we got ourselves into? You know, a couple months on a boat, now a couple of days, you know, almost 2 weeks walking in the woods. And then you get to the Connecticut Valley, and it's a magnificent place that must have seemed really like the promised land to them. And as I explored this a little further, there's definite imagery and symbolism in Connecticut that connects with that story of the Israelites being led out, brought out of Egypt and out of bondage in the Exodus, in the symbols of the state, and the state motto that was adopted by these same people, that he who brought us here will sustain us. And that story of Exodus, there is the deliverance out of oppression to the promised land that the Puritans identified. But this group coming down to Connecticut, you could see that they didn't just identify with it, they actually were living it. That journey out of oppression in England and the travel through the wilderness to their promised land.
You didn't have to blaze this trail. This trail was already the Indian trails?
They were following Indian trails. Good point, thank you. They were following Indian trails, and we have to give credit to the Indians that at that time, the chief down in Hartford came up to Boston and said, come on down to Connecticut. You know, they were looking for the English to come. And the Indians had a tradition of hospitality that they were helping the English to come through. The native trails, if you get out there and walk them, they'd be very narrow and it'd be easy to get lost. It's easy to get lost today out there. So that they had guides to bring them down to Connecticut. But that journey through the wilderness and that identifying with that powerful story of the Exodus, there was another part of the story of the Exodus that we have to think about as the conferring of law. The Israelites, and led by Moses, on their journey, they established the law. There was that image that we all have of Charlton Heston coming down from the clouds with the tablets. They have the law. And here in Connecticut, this group, along with the folks from Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield, gathered together in 1638, and Thomas Hooker, at the site of the State House, the old State House in Hartford, delivered a sermon establishing the power of the people to create a government and to create law, and that the choice of the magistrates was theirs. The people had the right to choose their leaders. The privilege of election is one that is a gift from God to the people directly. So God's empowering the people that came to Connecticut to create the law. And that this franchise is something that has to be taken seriously. It's not something to be influenced by the offers of a pint of ale, or today we have so many different groups spewing different things to influence our opinions. It's something to be taken seriously. And that the power to appoint the leaders is one that comes also with the people have the power to remove them. That there's no absolute right of power of the leadership, there's an absolute right of the people. And so in 1639, after much discussion, they got the fundamental orders adopted by the free men of Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford. And this established the first written constitution establishing the government here in Connecticut. And it has a line of descent going on down to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So you could say that, you know, the revolution, the American Revolution began a whole lot earlier than Lexington and Concord. It began with these people who came this great distance across the ocean and across the wilderness to Connecticut in the fundamental orders that had a preamble, which I never thought I'd be reading the preamble of fundamental orders. I had to look it up. But you start reading the words and you hear Thomas Hooker and this kind of connection with the powers given by God to the people. And then you read the orders, and they establish a government with real controls that looked at correcting the abuses that were seen in England. And through this all, unlike all the other colonies, there was no mention of the king. It wasn't that the government was established with the king's authority, it was established with the people's authority. And as I said, as I started reading this, and you read the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution, you start seeing that it started there and it evolved. And it had a tremendous influence on our history. And I found here in Connecticut that the General Assembly, because of the fundamental orders, took action to designate Connecticut as the Constitution state. You know, that thing on the bump on your license plates. Now, Connecticut's still revolutionary. I figured, well, this is something that, you know, there ought to be a lot going on. 375 years, you know, ago that this year. So I did a search. You know, now you can do searches on Google. You don't have to read newspapers. You just search and say, okay, show me news articles on this. Any celebrations or any mention of it. And you know what I found? None. There was a letter in the Hartford Current in the op-ed section, but no articles or publications of something that's a seminal event in the history of Connecticut in recognition. So it caused me to think maybe that black hole, there's still a little work to get it a little light on it.
You're really waiting for the 400s.
Well, I'll get back to you. I'm planning on checking that out. So finding the path of our ancestors, because I'm finding that it's not just my story, it's a whole bunch of people's story. From Cambridge, if you go up to Harvard and you stand at the gate and you look out at the green, that's about where this pilgrimage began. On down to the Connecticut River and this vista of modern Hartford. And that's their journey. And I'll share it with you so you can go out and find it yourself. And I went out and I said, gee, you know, I've got to try and find, can I figure out a route? Are there still some wild places we can find? And are there some artifacts? And the answer is yes, yeah, I can do that. And I'll share it. One of the things that helped, there are a lot of signs out there. It wasn't just in Woodstock. It's really amazing that this story is one that has captured imagination over time and is memorialized in Cambridge, in Wayland, in Ashland. It's in Hopkinton, which has an interesting story of its own. In Westboro, in Grafton, in Woodstock, and Ashford, and on down to Hartford, and I didn't get them all in. That these are things that over time, this story has had an importance to people that they felt should be recognized and memorialized. And when I went looking for it, unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot out there. Again, I do Google search, and I didn't find anything. You do Google search now, after this project has gone on for 3 or 4 years, you'll find it's all about me. Because everything's posted that I've done to share that. because it's a wonderful story that shouldn't be lost. So the route of the path, I'll give you the overview here. I figure about 10 miles a day, just projecting out a little bit beyond 128, and then to Framingham, down to Whitehall and Hopkinton. And Hopkinton was founded, the reason it's called Hopkinton is because of a grant from the Edward Hopkins, who was one of the governors of Connecticut, left money to Harvard. On to Sutton, down to Webster, Woodstock, Pine Hill out in Ashford, where there's a tradition that that's one of the places that they camped along the way, the Willimantic River, and then on down the valley of the Hockenham and the Tankerhoos, and on down to Hartford, with some branching off to Windsor and to Wethersfield. Now I did this, and I was kind of working in using old maps and old local traditions and records from the towns to be able to try and identify the route. And I was kind of flying blind, but I figured what I was finding worked, and I was posting everything up there. And then I finally, I heard about this guy, Robert Grady, that along the way I heard, oh, that Bob Grady was here, and whatever happened to what he was doing? Didn't really seem to know, but I finally caught up with the report after I'd done all my work. And I read it with some trepidation because I figured, oh gosh, I'm going to be shown to be a fool. And there actually was good agreement. It's nice to find that the Connecticut Historic Commission in their study came up with something that's essentially the same as what I've been sharing. And one of the key things that was good in their report that they brought out, that Indian trails, there wasn't just one trail. They would have trails that they would use in the winter up in the high country, and then they have summer trails down in the valleys. And the summer trails, the Indian trails in the valleys tended to get washed away because they'd be following the rivers. And as we know with settlement, they really got radically altered with building of roads, towns, damming of rivers. And he said, the best places that you could be most likely to find Indian trails would be up in the high country. So we have a tradition of maybe parallel trails going on down to Connecticut. We have a low trail down in the valley, which would be like along Route 44. And then we have this thing going on up in the hills, which is the beautiful part of the trip. And finding it, Ellen Larned, who was a historian of Windham County, who lived up here in Thompson, found her map of ancient Windham County, which is a real treasure, which the Historic Commission didn't appear to consider in their report, but I used. And the Connecticut Path, she showed the Old Connecticut Path right on her map. And the route that she picked up going back to 1874 when it was published. So it's going back to earlier generations than the stories that were handed down. And so when I started following this, I found the route coming down from Webster and the Narrows crossing the lake on down through Thompson to Woodstock, and it works very nicely. The Historic Commission chose to come down from Dudley along, really what's the road? And they were roads that were in use, so they would be parallel intersecting trails. We agreed going from Woodstock across the Crystal Pond, but Larned had an alternative that, as I look at it more closely and go out and explore, also worked really well. From Crystal Pond on over to Ashford, we were in agreement. There's a small amount of difference that we had going across Natchog State Forest. The red line is where I found the trail likely to be. They agreed with me most of the way, and then they said, well, gee, we'll just follow the Nipmuc Trail on over to a point where we get onto Howey Road, and then, that's where we wound up agreeing again. So it was just a matter of being within a half mile of each other, really. And then we got to a point where we didn't really agree out in Wellington. So we were doing pretty well. They used the information from Matthias Spies, who lived in Manchester and did a lot of work on native paths in the 1920s, 1930s. And they said, well, Matthias Spies said, you know, the path went from Bolton Notch on down to Hartford, right through the main street of Manchester. And so we really don't, we don't know how to connect this, so they kind of took a guess and they said, and they, to their credit in the report, they said, this is our most speculative part of the trail. The Connecticut Historical Commission said, there's no tradition, there's no on-the-ground evidence, but it's what we think might work, connecting from Wellington up there on the hill on down to Bolton Notch. But they didn't consider a couple of things that we have to understand. That, you know, that high and low trail, well, Spies said there was a trail that he called the Connecticut Path that went up Route 44 and then basically up through Eastford and into Woodstock and on up to Thompson. He said, this is the path, this is the way it is, there were no other paths. But clearly there was another way that he actually knew the answers to, he just wasn't ready to acknowledge. That if you get out to Wellington, he said, oh, you know, one of his letters to Harold Ayers, he said, you know, there was this trail that I've walked, and I give him credit because he got out and he actually walked. He walked from, basically from East Wellington on up over the hill, across Holland, and on over to Windsor, on the old dirt roads and the old paths. And he said, this is how, you know, you would have done it. And also that there was this survey by Solomon Safri and Daniel Woodward, a team that went across in 1642, and we have a map that's quite accurate that shows that they traveled across there. And you see how close it is to where we're agreeing. So that there was a path there. And when I went out and looked, there actually was some on-the-ground evidence of the trail in Holland that hadn't been considered by the Historic Commission. In an aerial photograph, it shows up as this road that's just really parallel to the highway. But you can go out there today in Holman State Forest and you can see pieces of the path. And in Holland, Madeline Regan, who has since passed on, she left a piece of her lead with a right-of-way to Joshua's Trust that she found out in a survey was part of the old route followed by the pioneers across Holland on their way to Windsor and on their way to Hartford. So survey data was there. And then Tim Gaudier, whom I met in this process, went through, he's gone through and compiled 6,000 deeds and records in Holland. And he identified, going using deed records, paths, the path coming across the green, going out west parallel to Route 74, and one going off to Windsor through Wellington, another coming down parallel to Route 74 and going on to Hartford, and then a third one that he found going up over the hill on parallel to Old Post Road. And these were going back to the settlement of Holland and identifying where the first paths were in town. So when we look at this, even though we have the Historic Commission saying it went this way, Spies said, you know, if they had made it to Holland, they probably would have taken the Nipmuc path on down to Hartford, because that was another one of the Indian trails that he knew about. And so if we use that, we have pretty good basis of saying we have historic information through deeds and records. We have physical evidence of early trails running through Holland that connect with the route that would come down from Wellington. So what I think we have is we have two paths that ran parallel, that served different purposes at different time. The beauty of what we have is that one of those routes remains substantially wild up there in the hills. The other, along Route 44, it may be a historic route. I don't think we'd want to walk along that way today. Those semis going by makes you a little nervous. So now I want to share with you, here's what you came for. You said, okay, that's all the historical stuff. Here's the last Green Valley, and I've taken the liberty of extending it out just a little bit here to Sutton, which, it's not a purity thing, it's just where there's a good connection in history with the path, going on across Webster and Dudley and Thompson and down to Tolland. And I'll share with you, I'm going to let this run here and show some pictures and just be able to talk with you about some of the things that you'll see. And why I started in Sutton, at West Sutton, is at Waters Farm. We have a record of, this is likely the site of the Manchog Praying Village looking over on Manchog Pond, which is an extraordinarily beautiful place along the path that leads right into a 3-mile journey through the Douglas Woods. And in the woods there, we find evidence of early travel and use of this as a way, and also the opportunity to really enter into a wilderness that's 5 miles off of 390 or 395. So we have a chance to really enter a wilderness connecting from the Blackstone Valley and Sutton on down to Webster. And as we cross into Webster, there's a whole series of stone bridges coming down Mine Brook, which is state-owned land and is accessible. And if you know where the Dragon is, then you know where Mine Brook is. And we skip over to Dudley, and the conservation lands along Boston Road offer an opportunity to enter the woods in an area along the route of the path and get into the land leading into Thompson in the area of Cordes Hill. And we find coming down Shumway Brook these stone bridges and a foot trail along the Quinnebog River leading down to the area that would likely be a fording place on the river. 3 miles through the Thompson Woods leads over the hill to Woodstock, which was really a hub of native trails, and is the reason that Woodstock has been so interested in their history of settlement, of exploring places like the Pulpit Rock that's in Woodstock, and offering walks along the Old Connecticut Path. This one was, I went with Nick Bellantoni, that give you a chance to explore some of the places that are along the path that are hidden today. And going west towards Crystal Pond, there's a wilderness that's remarkable in its beauty that's still there to be enjoyed. And we come to Camp Nahako and Crystal Pond, and going beyond Buell Orchards, we really enter the wilderness of Yale Forest. And the trail does lead across. We have designated spots that we can use as references to help guide us in being able to interpret where the trail is. Coming down into Natchog State Forest, and here are the Nipmuc Trail. There's a section of the Nipmuc Trail that actually follows the Old Connecticut Path. So it's really been in use for 400 or 500 years. On across the Mount Hope River up towards Westford Hill, and looking and walking through this wilderness. So you're getting a sense, I hope, of some of the things that are still there when we say a trail that was used 375 or more years ago. We can find substantial pieces of it as we travel across this wilderness. And we can see the evidence of, that's still there of the settlement that came afterwards here at Moose Meadow in Willington as we're going up over the last hill onto the Willimantic River. So when I said there's something extraordinary that's there, there's an opportunity with some of the places that are open for public to walk to really get into the woods and experience the land here as we cross over the Willimantic to Nyholm and going beyond on to Tallinn Center. So really there is an extraordinary opportunity to travel on or near this route, crossing the last Green Valley. Now, let me see if I can get this. I'm going to go through real quickly here some things that have evolved. In 2011, I thought I really knew what was going on after a year of digging, so I got an opportunity to share it with the folks over in Woodstock at the Historical Society. And I did it PowerPoint, and I thought this was really neat. And I said, afterwards, it was good. They were wonderful people, but I have to tell the story differently. So I said, well, I'll try doing it on video, and I explored using YouTube. Let's see, anyone seen any one of these YouTube videos? A few of you have seen, okay. It was a learning experience doing this. But over time, we're up to about 18,000 views of YouTube videos of pieces along the Connecticut Path. And I said, well, gee, I also need to be able to explain a little bit more, so I put together the website to link the videos and also things that you couldn't put in a video. And that's up to about 24,000 visits. From people all over the country and in England and Canada. And when I look at those maps on Google where they say where are people watching your videos or seeing what you're putting on the web, you get Sri Lanka. Who in Sri Lanka is watching these videos? Don't they have anything better to do? There are countries all over the world where this is penetrating. But I want to draw your attention, there's a section dedicated to the last Green Valley and pages on the website that you can go to visit, and that will lead you to the videos that take you into some of the places that I found. Now, these days, you can't do anything without being on Facebook and social media, and this has proven to be another way that people from, because on Facebook you can look and see where are people going, I like this, and they're coming from all over the country. We're up to about 341 likes at this point, and we're growing. But every week there's something that I'll put up there that's a picture, a photo, or an event that's occurring to invite people to get involved and come and explore. And through this, there's been a lot of folks who said, I want to come. Or when I come to New England, I want to come here. And I don't know if you've come across any of the presentations. There's been real interest among the historical societies and the conservation groups and genealogical societies to learn about this. And I've had opportunity to really talk with and present to the historical societies. And it's interesting, when you do the historical societies, you usually have the conservation people, the trails people, the land trust people in each of the towns, because they all serve on the same committees. Oh, and the library, you got to give credit to the library people too. That really brings the community together, and we've had, I think, Tallinn, we had over 100 people come out on a night. The real remarkable one was in little tiny Eastford. We had about 80 people come in and cram into a room smaller than this.
I was there.
It was interesting. It was like,
Ran out of cookies really fast.
yeah, they had cookies. They knew how to put on a good show. So we've begun to reach a lot of people to share this and tie it into the story of their towns and the places that they live. And as we're doing this, as we're doing tonight, we've been recording the presentations because we've gotten away from oral history and sharing the stories. But YouTube and video helps us to maybe bring that back so that there's another way of telling a story, rather than writing a book or an article that a few people might see. That we really are living in creating a way of telling a story that people who are far away can experience, or maybe 100 years from now can look at it and say, what was it like then? And what's it like now? So you can go and visit on the website and see some of the programs. If I was in one of your towns and you want to see, each program has some similar things, and then there's things that are specific to the town, and then things that I'm learning as I'm going along. And one of the things that I learned as I'm doing this, because if you have one person that is in your family tree that went to Connecticut, you wind up having a whole bunch. I have a whole bunch, and this is just the ones that are the founders, listed as founders of the 3 towns. There are hundreds more. So I usually run into cousins that we have share a connection through family. And so I've shared on the website, there's a section, really, are we cousins? Finding your family heritage. So it's really expanded beyond just being a story about getting from here to there. But one of the things that I really yearn to do, and started work now, and have to say, last Green Valley in October has been one of the ways of helping to do this, is the need to get beyond the virtual world of watching a video or looking at something on a website and actually getting out and experiencing this environment. And to do that, I'm in the process, and I can share some of the things that are there for you. Compiling places that you can walk and driving routes you can follow to get to them that take you out into the country along and near the route of the path. Now the driving tours, as I said, there are some wonderful country roads that come across the last Green Valley that run very close, or in some places right on the path. And to be able to find them, I've created some tours, and let's see, the red line down here, if you follow it from Webster, there are tours going from Webster on down to Willington. You can see it's kind of snakes because the roads don't follow precisely where the path is. But the green line shows you really how, across this landscape, it's a pretty direct route. It curved around the hills and the obstacles, but for a walking path, it worked really well. For roads, not so good. And the other that's a real gem for you is just getting off and taking the Center Turnpike on from the interstate on back all the way up to Webster. It has some beautiful landscape, particularly up there, Boston Hollow, Bigelow Brook, and Yale Forest. So I've taken these in. There's an application that I can't show you here. It's a free app. I didn't have a smartphone when I started this. I now have a smartphone. It's smarter than me, obviously. But there's a free app called Every Trail that works on iPhones and Android phones, and you can download it. And if you use that app, or you go on the website, you can see the tours that are broken out from Webster to Woodstock, and Woodstock to Eastford, and Eastford to Westford, and then from Westford to the Willimantic. There's a map, there's a slideshow of pictures along the way, places to visit. If you're using this while you're out driving, the little dot moves with you because it's got GPS, or you can download the GPS information if you want to use it in other ways. You can jump into Google Earth, which who knew about Google Earth a few years ago? You can fly over things, you can see how it looks from above. So it's a way to explore, but also a way to guide you into it. I'm not going to dare turn the phone back on. There's another app that I'm beginning to explore called Napkin. And what Napkin does, you know how those, using the take me to directions, you say, I want to get to the last Green Valley from my house. I put it on Google Maps and it told me turn here, go there. Well, that tells you where to go from point to point. But if you want to design a custom tour and put in things that are really unique, Napkin allows you to put in your own story to go with it. So This is the mapkin from eastward to westward. At each of these blurbs, there's a little story that comes up, and the computer has a much nicer voice than me. But for example, here, it says, you're approaching Crystal Pond Road. Buell Orchard is up the hill. You can stop and get some apples and some cider. And Buell Orchard, the path crosses right over, which you'll see in a couple of minutes. So it becomes another way of helping to bring people to these places that aren't familiar with these back roads. And I want to warn anyone that's afraid to go out there that they might get lost. Don't worry, if you get lost, it's, that's half the fun. So you'll find things even when you get lost. The other part of this is really getting out and walking the path, and pieces of it that are open to the public. And as I said, October last year, we had 85 people show up for a walk in the path up in Wilmington from Fenton Ruby Park, and an interpreted guided walk, myself along with a naturalist and a botanist. So we were able to interpret the history, the natural history of the environment, the changes. And we had 85 people come out for a beautiful walk along the path. But there's some places that are really, you can go and visit today to walk, that are bringing on or near the path. I started up in Sutton at Waters Farm, the Douglas Woods, and it is a 3-mile wilderness to cross to Webster. How many of you, Memorial Beach in Webster, if you go down there, it has a magnificent view of Webster Lake. I won't say the Indian name. And the Narrows, and the place where the Chabungamock Praying Village was established. You can see it's now condos on the lake, but you can have this magnificent view. It's an easy walk. And the Perryville Trace down along the French River, and some of the wonderful conservation lanes in Dudley that are along the Rail Trail. If any of you have influence in Thompson or in Connecticut, please try to get the state and the towns to work with the Providence-Worcester Railroad to get that right away. So we have a rail trail from Webster all the way up to, I think they're going to ultimately go all the way out to Palmer if they can make this work. But there's some wonderful places along there. And these will have guides that you will be able to find your way. And I'm working to get those on the website. Ellen Larned, if we use her map, I've come up with at least 10, 12 places that are public places that you can walk that are on or near the path. I'm going to go and tell you about a couple of them because they relate to upcoming events where we're inviting people to join us on some walks along the path. You can check these out on the website. There is a Connecticut section of the walks. But I want to share with you, before I get to the ones that are upcoming, I'm in the process of putting this also on the Every Trail app, so if you did want to go for a walk on the trails as we get them on there, you can use this as your guide, or load it down onto your own GPS to walk in the woods and have a guide that will let you know you're on the right trail. Because there are some spots you can take a wrong turn, which I'm not afraid to say I've done. Coming up, a couple of events that you should be aware of, I want you to be aware of, that are walks that will be open to the public. In August, on August 11th, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, the Woodstock Historical Society, and Historic New England are working together to do a program in Woodstock. We're bringing people as part of their Come Home to New England. New England Historic Genealogical Society runs a week-long Come Home to New England program for folks who want to come and do research on their ancestry. They do it in Boston, but we're bringing them out to Woodstock. Because if there's ever a place, if you come from anywhere else in the country, you want to see New England and get a good sense of the country, come to Woodstock. So we're doing that on August 11th, and I'll be doing a program and a guided walk for those who were able to walk along the area that's part of the National Historic Register of the Old Connecticut Path in Woodstock, along the green and from Roseland Cottage out to Elliott Rock and Pulpit Rock. There's another walk coming along this Saturday on June 7th. I'm not doing it. That's part of the Connecticut Trails Day weekend. That's out there in Woodstock on Pulpit Rock. Actually, the Pulpit Rock Road is where I have it going from. They're coming in from the other side. In the Rappaport Spalding Preserve. And Ellen Larned, in her route that she mapped, it actually goes through the Rappaport Spalding Preserve on the upper end. And if you go there, it's just a beautiful, easy walk along this old Woodstock road,
Jason,
and a beaver dam and pond there.
I was just out there last week, and our member program in July is actually going to be a walk on that spot. I just met with Jess Stefanik, Linden Land Trust last week, and so we're actually going to, in July, we haven't picked a date yet, but for members, keep your eye open for that. We're going to do that very hike sometime in July as a member program.
I'll put that one on mine, because I
I'll let you
want to
know.
find a
I
better
didn't know
way to
that it
do
was
it
connected to
there.
this.
And share the walk, because this is one of those places that you can get off and get a sense of what would it be like to walk through this wilderness. Steve Broderick and I are doing a walk as part of Walktober out in Eastford at Camp Nahaco on October 19th. And that's a wonderful place to walk. That's kind of a hidden gem there in Eastford. And Steve actually owns land in Woodstock where the path crosses over, so we may go down into that also. And I mentioned Buell Orchard earlier, and their great apples and their really delicious cider. This is Camp Nahaco, and right about through the center of their orchard is the route of the Old Connecticut Path. So if you've been to Buell Orchard, you can say, I've been on the Connecticut Path. Coming up on Saturday, I'll be leading a walk sponsored by the Ashford Historical Society as part of their 300th anniversary. We're going to go on a walk into Nipmuc and Natchog trails in Natchog State Forest. So I'll take you on down, a group on down into the forest using the Blue Blaze trails, the Natchog and Nipmuc trails, to that section that is the old Indian trail that's been in use for 400 or more years, and really give you a sense of being in the wilderness there. So that's coming up on this coming Saturday at 1. And on Sunday, we have an easier walk, a family walk along Old Howie Road in Ashford. It's a two-parter, but it'll be one walk. There's a wonderful area that Joshua Trust owns on Fern Glade that will be going down to the Old Connecticut Path follows the Old Howie Road, and we go down to Knowlton Brook, and then turn around after we've had a nice view of the beauty of the woods there, and head on down to a land following Howie Road to the Langhammer Woods in Ashford that is being developed as a place with trails for it's a conservation area. That also is an extraordinarily beautiful place along the Old Connecticut Path. And I have to say, I advertise this, these two areas, the Joshua Trust and Langhammer, connect with the Ruby Fenton Park in Willington. So we have a 2-mile stretch of the trail that's very easy walking. Now, I've been wrestling with what to do with this, and I've had people ask me over the years, well, gee, what do you think we should do, or what would you do with this? Well, and I'm still putting pieces together as I'm doing this, because it's, as I think one thing that leads to another, as you've seen. That I followed the path on down from Boston and Cambridge, and on down to Hartford and Windsor and Wethersfield. I haven't really figured out, what is it that I would say? I've been asked, should we make it a historic register? We get into all sorts of process with the government. Should the state step in to try and help? We all know how when the state tries to help you that things might not come out the way you planned. That I finally came up with, it really came down to two words, is a heritage tree. You don't need to have necessarily a government agency saying, okay, this is the official thing. Because groups have identified places that they want to bring attention to. In a heritage trail, when we talk about families going on down to Connecticut, that makes a certain amount of sense. And there's a rich history going across Massachusetts that gives it certainly something that we could say connects two states together, and the towns here in Connecticut together. And as I look at this, there are areas that break out, and really the largest chunk of this is right here in the last Green Valley. And one of the things, and you brought this up, that these were Indian trails, and I started thinking, well, what are the tribes, and how do we recognize the contribution of the Indians and the natives who lived here for thousands of years prior to the English arriving? Maybe really to recognize that this was really the Nipmuc and Mohegan lands here coming across the last Green Valley. The Hassanamiscos, there's really a stretch across the Blackstone Valley and going east. We have the Muckamco Indians in Hopkinton.
There was quite a few tribes way back.
In groups that we begin to recognize that there were people here. Each of these groups along the way, and what I also found connecting going down is that there's a 10-mile greenway, the Tankerbusen and the Hockenham greenways leading on down to Hartford. So we have a wonderful opportunity to connect these pieces and use the heritage of this as a connector. One of the things, since I really am an advocate for walking the path, I was really pleased. I had a message from a member of the Eastford Historical Society that the Eastford students, the third grade, was doing a historic tour of Eastford. And they developed a guide, and they worked into their guide that they're going to have lunch at Camp Nahaco on Crystal Pond. And at that spot, they're going to talk about the Connecticut Path and Thomas Hooker and the pioneers that came through Connecticut right there. And what better way to bring this into the lives of children, to make history alive for them? And I shared back with them, I said, if there's one thing that the kids could walk away with beyond that, is the fact that, we think pioneers, we think strong men and stronger women. There were children who made this journey, and children were pioneers. And for them to see themselves as pioneers as they explore this area. And I really have been thinking of, how can we create that experience of walking 10 miles in the wilderness to really have that sense of what would a day be like? And granted, we have freeze-dried, we have, Gore-Tex, we have a whole lot of things that they didn't have. But just the experience of walking the sustained distance. There is a place between Crystal Pond and Willington and Ruby Fenton that it's possible to, it may be possible, right now there's a good portion of it that's open, but it may be possible to be connected to create this kind of heritage trail and founding families path that links up the 2 miles that are down, let me see if I can do this, 2 miles linking from Fenton Ruby and Langhammer and Fleagle Farm that are now open and you can walk. And through Walktober and our upcoming walk, we will brought groups along. Camp Nahako, where we're going to do a Walktober, is another piece.
Ask them to do that without a phone.
That's to do it. And finally, the piece that I'll be doing on Saturday at Natchitoches State Forest. But as you see, the blue trail here is the Nipmuc Trail, and leads almost up to where we would connect over beyond Molten Brook. So there's a gap there that maybe over time, working with the landowners and the people in the community might seek to work to connect, as they've done with the blue trails. And going east, there's a big section here that is really unknown, unused, across Natchitoches State Forest, Yale Forest, up to the Bigelow Brook. And there's a gap there that some of the owners have been willing to say, gee, we might be able to create something. And there's also Yale Forest. So there's an opportunity over time to connect these. So we really have a 10-mile trail that could be walked and give that sense of experience of walking in the wilderness as they do. And as when I'm there next Saturday, I'm going to be pointing out, we're going down to this place called Pine Hill, that we're only about 5.5 miles from 84, which the only thing I knew about Ashford when I started this was that when you drive down 84, there's the Ashford Motel. Now I know a whole lot more about Ashford, but 5 miles off the highway is this place called Pine Hill, and that is where tradition, as Ellen Marnard recorded, is where the Hooker congregation camped along the journey to Connecticut. And if you go, this is private land, but it's not going to a peak. There's an ancient roadway that's just off the Eastward Road. It's been bypassed. It was the path, the route of the path. And they camped up on the hill. And I'm going to take you down into this area. On this side is the portion, a piece of the Nipmuc Path that follows right on the Connecticut Path, which would be the Indian Path. And a fan, I didn't put the sign up, said this has been in use for 400 years. They must have read one of my articles or something. The power of this is that as we get further along and people are having more difficulty traveling those long distances, winding up Route 84 to get to Maine, to get to the wilderness, or New Hampshire, if we go to Pine Hill, where you are in the wilderness, 5 miles off the highway, 4.8 million people live. It's within reach. If we go 100 miles out, it's really phenomenal. We start getting to like 15 million people. That this is a wilderness that is truly right here for so many people. Most who will just drive right up Route 84 and never know, as I once didn't know. How can we make this happen over time? I've been out doing the work that I can through these groups, but I'm thinking that we should invite these groups and others to become friends of the Old Connecticut Path Heritage Trail and start linking the groups together to work to make this happen and be able to share it with others and bring people here. So that some point in the future, people will come and they will stand here on the Connecticut River looking across at modern Hartford, and they'll begin to be able to imagine the faces of the men, women, and children who traveled through the wilderness to establish Connecticut so long ago. I hope that you will go and you will enjoy your time doing your homework, exploring the places along the Old Connecticut Path, here in the last Green Valley and beyond. So thank you. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website